Okay, welcome everyone. We'll just wait a couple seconds to allow people some time to join. And we're really excited to host everyone today. My name is Amber Bennett, and I am working with the Climate Narratives Initiative. And we have about 350 people registered. So we'll take a few moments to allow people some time to join. We're really excited to host today's webinar on what Canadians think about climate change and what's holding us back. I'm joining you from Calgary, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda and Métis Nations. While we're waiting for people to join, I encourage you to also use the chat to introduce yourselves, let us know where you're coming from, and we'll get started here in a couple minutes. I'm excited to say that we have people from every province in Canada joining us today. We've got people from all levels of government. We have Indigenous leaders, healthcare workers, faith leaders, climate advocates, and a wide range of people. So it's really exciting. I think, great. So we've got Laura Lee, who's just introduced herself, and I encourage everyone to do that. A few housekeeping notes before we jump in. You can use the chat function today to share information with each other and provide some reactions. Also, I encourage you to introduce yourselves while we're waiting. We are recording today's session, so we'll share that recording as well as the report following the webinar. If you're having any technical issues, you can text 587-437-5707. And just to say, when the webinar closes today, there will be a link for you to provide us some feedback, not only on the webinar, but also on some of the opportunities that we have coming up. Okay, well, I think without further ado, we can jump in. I'm really excited to say that we have three amazing speakers today. We have communications expert Kara Pike, who is the executive director of Climate Access, who is co-hosting the webinar today. And we have senior strategists Chris Hatch and Hugo Seguin, who are both authors of the report in which we'll be diving into today. I think that's about it. We will first go through the findings of the report. There'll be a break for some questions for people on the key findings, so for both Chris and Hugo, and then we'll move into what it means for communicators, and Kara will share some recommendations, and then we'll open up for all speakers, and we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So once again, welcome. Very excited to be hosting What Canadians Think About Climate Change and What's Holding Us Back. And before we start, I think we're going to have a few quiz questions on climate. And so Maria Granados, who is supporting both Climate Narratives Initiative and Climate Access over the next few months to host webinars like this, trainings, and be a lead within the community, is going to walk us through that. So Maria, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So like Amber mentioned, I'm going to kick us off with some polling questions here just to test your climate opinion knowledge. So I'm going to launch the poll here. You should all be able to see it. I'll give everybody a minute or two to answer the questions, and then we'll walk through what the correct answers are. Are we able to answer the polls? There we go. Getting some answers coming in.
We have a note from Laura Lee saying it doesn't allow her to submit.
I'm not sure why, Laura Lee. You can maybe
you have to fill out all questions in order to submit. Thank you, Atia.
Yes, there are 5 questions in the poll here. And if you are having any troubles at all, just scroll down, look for question 5. And if you're not able to find it, then just submit your answers in the chat and we can also compare through there.
All right, excellent. We've got some answers coming in, 115.
I'll give everyone, let's see, 20 more seconds.
All right, we've still got some folks, we've got about 25% of you who haven't jumped in yet. So I encourage you to do that. Please continue as we're moving through to introduce yourself using the chat. We'd love to know who's here and who's joining us. And once again, welcome to everybody. And thank you for joining for the next, spending time with us for the next hour and a half.
All right, I am going to go ahead and close the poll now, and then we're going to share the answers here and review. So sharing the polling results here. So question 1 is, what percentage of Canadians are seriously worried about climate change? So the majority of you answered 67% of Canadians are seriously worried about climate change. But actually, according to a 2020 Abacus poll, it is higher than that. So we have 75% of Canadians who are seriously worried about climate change here. For question 2, we go, what percentage of Canadians under 30 years of age think climate change is an extremely serious problem compared to Canadians over 45 who say the same? So the answer, the majority of you answered 40% versus 25%. And you're right. So 40% of Canadians under the age of 30 think climate change is an extremely serious problem compared to 25% of Canadians over the age of 45 who say the same. Again, this comes from another 2020 Abacus poll that we will be covering in the report today. Question 3, we have a broad transformative agenda to address community vulnerability, inequality, climate, and racism in 2020 is popular with what percent of blank percent of Canadians and blank percent of conservatives say now is not the time. We have the majority answering 70% of Canadians and 25% of conservatives saying it's not the time. Actually, it's 60% of Canadians and 63% of conservatives that say it's not the time. And this is coming from an Environics survey that went out last year as well. So we're doing pretty good on our answers here. There's some surprises. So question 4, what percent of Canadians believe an energy transition will be beneficial for Canada in the long term versus this number of Albertans who say the same? So you were right. The majority of you answered 75 versus 54% here. And our final question that we have is, this percentage of Canadians think it's definitely possible for the world to reach climate targets recommended by the IPCC. So it looks like the majority of you answered 30%, but in reality, it's only 16% of Canadians think it's definitely possible for the world to reach the climate targets. But what's interesting is that over 70% of Canadians in the majority of polls have answered that they believe the government is doing enough. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there, but we'll dive into that once we get through sharing the results. So thank you for participating in the climate trivia, and I will pass it. I'll pass it over to our first speaker, or pass it back to Amber.
Thank you, Maria. So we are going to spend the next 20 minutes or so taking a look at some of the key findings of the report. And we will invite Chris Hatch, who is a communications strategist, and he is the former executive editor of the National Observer, as well as the executive director of the Rainforest want to get this right, Rainforest Action Network. And Chris was the lead author and has spent many hours pouring through polls to bring you this report. So thank you, Chris. And without further ado, over to you.
Great, thanks, Amber. Everyone hear me okay? It's great to see people, all of you here from all across the country today. Just to let you know and be clear, I'm not a pollster myself. I come at all this from environmental and climate campaigns, which I've been working on since the 1990s. And what we're interested in today is how we build a solid social mandate for really serious climate action. We're not just looking for the biggest top line public opinion results that you can use to weaponize and convince people that you have the public on side. We're also digging underneath those big top line numbers and looking at why so many people can be worried about climate, but things go off the rail when it comes time for action. How is it that people can be really freaked out about wildfires raging, but also freak out if they think they have to give up their gas stoves? So just very briefly, you'll see we looked at quite a few polls, actually even slightly earlier than 2019 through to early in 2021, trying to get a snapshot of where things were at before the pandemic, and then of course, importantly, through the pandemic. And here's the good news. Most Canadians understand that climate is a big problem, and they're seriously worried about it. Another really important point that comes out of the findings is that an energy transition is something people have heard about and have taken to heart at this point. A huge majority of Canadians think an energy transition is now inevitable, which is of course a very important leverage point in communications. And on a similar point, support for clean energy is extremely high, and it's support that cuts across all demographics, all regions, pretty much all Canadians, even of every political persuasion, are highly supportive. And also very good news is that COVID does not seem to have dampened concern at all. There's a lot of support for building back better and a just transition. Of course, the pandemic is the higher priority for people right now, but most people support building back with a green recovery. Just having trouble advancing the slides. There we go. But here's some things to keep in mind. And one of the most important that we want to emphasize today is that most of that huge level of support falls into a muddled, movable middle. It's about 45% of the Canadian public. So about half of the Canadian public don't really understand the issue. They don't really understand this process of how climate change works. They certainly don't understand what's actually needed to happen in order to address it. And they haven't become personally engaged yet. This has big consequences. One is that demand for action or support for actual policies and specific actions is much lower than the amount of generalized concern about climate. And when push comes to shove on a difficult issue, people don't really have mental yardsticks. They can't evaluate if something is real climate action or not. So they're vulnerable to misinformation, to backlash. They can agree that climate is a problem and still vote against funding transit improvements or whatever hot button issue comes along. Okay, so let's dive in. These are all results from 2020. So really interesting to see that in the midst of the pandemic, people still think climate change is a serious crisis. And what this shows is that the public really has embraced pro-climate attitudes and norms. And it's not a distant issue in the way it used to be. Since 2014, there's been a double-digit increase in the sense that climate is a here and now issue. And that's a really important point in climate communication that we'll be talking about in a bit. Proximity is one of those really critical mental models that unlocks engagement. But of course, how worried you are about something is a different question than how high a priority it is. And just briefly to say that folks like Environics have looked at this over, tracked it for many years. Back in 2007, 2008, climate for the first time rose to the top of the public agenda. It's around the time of Inconvenient Truth. Then, of course, 2008, we all know the Great Recession wiped almost everything else off the top of the agenda. And climate bumbled along in with a mix of issues until finally surging back in 2019, around the time of the climate strikes and leading into our last federal election. Of course, again, gets wiped off the top of the agenda by the pandemic. But what's really interesting is that although the pandemic lowered climate on people's priorities for government, even well into the pandemic, people are very worried. And in fact, they're pretty much as worried about climate as they are about COVID. These results are from the Prairie Climate Center in Winnipeg, who were in the field in December 2020. And what you see is that the bars are pretty much the same, right? People are as concerned when you ask them about climate as they are about COVID. So although it's dropped in terms of priority, the underlying concern for climate is still there. So that's sort of broad strokes where we're at. When you dig underneath these numbers, you find some really big differences between audiences. Now, this is a slide showing some of the classic sort of demographics. Before we get into these specific audiences, I just want to point out there's a really important research gap on some really important points and audiences. We don't know nearly as much in Canada as we should about how Indigenous leadership and climate attitudes intersect. We know very little about BIPOC audiences and climate in Canada, even though we know from the United States that African American and Latinx audiences have some of the highest levels of concern. And the indications are that the dynamics are the same here in Canada. Researchers I know are talking about doing more on this, but there's still a big gap in terms of research around climate justice issues in Canada. But here are some things that we do know. The most disruptive difference is political identity. You see this on the right. There's real polarization over climate and energy, which is, of course, a serious problem for durable and long-term progress. Climate's become an identity issue. It's part of a culture divide and culture war. But you also find big differences in demographics. Younger generations are much more attuned than older ones, as we saw in that quiz at the beginning, and women much more than men. We're just looking at one set of polling results here. You often find much bigger gap between men and women. So your most accessible audiences are women and young people. And as we touched on a moment ago, good reason to think, and emerging research in Canada, that there's enormous receptivity around people of color and so-called new Canadians. I don't want to drill into regional differences very much today. You all know that lots of people in Alberta, Saskatchewan look at the issues through a different lens than people in Quebec, for example. Those differences aren't as extreme as you might think from the media, and especially social media. And if you want to drill deeper into details of attitudes where you live or where your work is landing, we just point you to one really great resource here from Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal, led a team modeling the country all the way from the national down to riding levels on a whole series of attitudes. But we do want to emphasize this difference in audience here. And in fact, if you only take one thing away today, it might be this. Big numbers, big percentages of the public are concerned. It's 2/3, 3/4, sometimes even more. But there's a really important segmentation underneath those numbers. The vast majority of our accessible audience doesn't really understand the issue, and they aren't engaged. Here we're looking at work also by Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal. He adapted this, what you might have heard of the 6 Americas model in the United States. In Canada, it turns out there are 5 Canadas. The 2 really important ones for our purposes are the 1/4 of the public that are alarmed, and this is our core base of support, motivated, very supportive of policies and actions to address climate change. But then there's this much bigger segment. It's about 45% of the public, call it the concerned. This is almost half of the Canadian population. These folks are worried, but they really don't understand the issue or what needs to be done about it. Their support is not reliable in a real world situation. And we think that this segmentation is really useful for thinking about the work we have to do, because a lot of communicators spend almost all of their time communicating with some subset of the alarmed, really mostly just government that is talking to the public more widely about climate. And that concerned segment is enormous. As we said, almost half the public. They're the middle that swings elections and swings issues one way or another. And it's really interesting to get away from the sort of more abstract polling numbers to understand where this concerned segment is and watch real people in focus groups. Quite sobering, really. Most Canadians in a focus group can't name an effective climate policy, really any climate policy. What they talk about is recycling, water conservation, plastic straws, increasingly tree planting. Most won't mention cars or buildings, even those kinds of things that are, emitting carbon and the most tangible things they interact with in their daily life. So having this big muddled movable middle has important consequences, as we touched on at the beginning. One is that demand for more action and support for policies is much lower than concern about climate. Here we're looking at results, the only results I think that I know of that have come out after the federal government announced its enhanced national climate plan at the end of last year. So in early 2021, Abacus was in the field and found that 71% of Canadians graded federal climate action good or acceptable. The takeaway is that people are worried about global warming, but are also fairly satisfied with what government is doing. That 71% number, if you do the math, translates into only 29% that actually disapprove of federal action. So there again, you might be seeing that segment of the alarmed. Those kind of 1/4 numbers crop up all the way through the polling. In the report, we dig into this question of demand for more action, support for existing actions quite a lot more. But what's important is that even before all the news, there was lots of news about the enhanced federal climate plan, it's not like there was a huge pent-up demand for more action. This is also Abacus, just so we're apples to apples, and from earlier in 2020. It's actually on the low end of how much dissatisfaction there is. But what you're seeing here is around, close on 50% of people think the government is doing about the right amount, shifting to a cleaner economy. And that's pretty much where things land on average, somewhere around half. Dissatisfaction is somewhere around 42 to 57%, depending on the poll and the time and the way it's asked. Another way of getting at how people think we're doing, how satisfied they are, is to look at where Canadians think we stack up compared to other countries in the world. You probably run into this a lot. Claims that we have the best policies and regulations in the world, Canada's only 1.8% of the population. What about China? Those kind of international conversations. And the basic upshot is that the public really wants us to be out in front. And importantly, the public thinks we already are. 2/3 of Canadians want us to be among the most ambitious or world-leading countries in the world. 89% think we're average or better than our peers around the world today. So that's just translates into just 11% that think we're taking things more slowly than our peers. That's not even half of the alarm segment that we spoke about earlier, which you'll remember was about 25%. So people have a much higher perception of our performance than you might expect. Now, I say than you might expect because I imagine this next slide won't surprise many of you here today, but clearly it would surprise most of your audiences. This is Canada compared to the rest of the G7 in terms of actual emissions. And you can see that our self-conception in actual results in cutting greenhouse gases is quite different than the reality, where even the US, Canadians think we're doing massively better than the United States. But even the US has been cutting emissions. Countries like Germany, especially the UK, much more aggressively still. Okay, so we've covered that Canadians are really concerned, but also big segments of the population think we're doing okay. In the report, we get into some of the underlying dynamics and public attitudes, obstacles in the way of progress. Big one is climate literacy, which we've touched on before. It's not just that people need more facts. It's not that facts drive attitudes, but people do need to have a mental model of what needs to happen. So a sense of a transition that we get fossil fuels off the electricity grid and transition vehicles, buildings, factories over to clean power. But a big one we should touch on as well is efficacy, or what wonks call efficacy. And this is the question of whether people think anything can actually be done about it all. This is interesting. You see that Quebecers are more optimistic than the rest of Canada, but it's pretty striking finding, really. Almost 60% in the rest of Canada don't really think we're going to get much done in the next decade, even if governments really try to cut carbon emissions. This is another way of getting at the question of efficacy. If you explain to people what cutting pollution to net zero is about, the public breaks into even thirds on whether it's possible or they just don't know. So those are some of the kind of spots where a climate conversation gets stuck. And I think they really show the importance of painting that tangible picture of the transition for people. In the report that you'll have shortly, we look at a bunch of other topics that I'll let you dig into more yourself. But one of the big ones we want to touch on today is about this question of transition and where we're headed. And the question is, do normal Canadians, and not just us climate nerds, have they heard about the energy transition? Do they think it's actually a thing? And the answer is that they do. They may not have a clear picture of what it is, but we're well over the threshold on the question of whether it's real. And this is a really important point of leverage in public dialogue. The public agrees it's inevitable. They think it's a global phenomenon, and they think it's going to happen whether we like it or not. So this is very useful to you as a frame. You can feel confident communicating that we all agree this transition is underway, and therefore, X, Y, Z. And related to this point on transition, Canadians are hugely supportive when issues are framed in terms of clean energy. This was just a fascinating finding that jumped out at me and has really stuck with me. It's a great example of the power of framing. In the same poll, people were asked, the same people were asked various questions about the energy transition, and it turns out you get double the amount of support for 100% renewables as you do for a complete phase out of fossil fuels, which you all on this call will know are exactly the same thing. And actually switching to clean energy support for that is much higher even than concern about climate change. So hugely important frame when you can frame your issues and conversations in terms of clean energy. And an emerging thing that actually has very similar dynamics in terms of being more popular than the level of concern about climate even is nature-based solutions, hugely popular across all demographics, all regions. And in the report, we also look at more systemic solutions, so laws and proposals and regulations. And one of the things that jumps out, as you'll see the way we've broken up this slide, is that over and over again, you see that core group of the alarmed that we talked about, around 1/4, 25 roughly % of the public. They're the only group that really understand that we need to get off burning fossil fuels entirely, that we need to drive carbon pollution to zero. These are the folks that strongly support actions. And then you have this larger group who are fuzzier on what needs to happen. They're less motivated, they're less reliable. Some of the other topics we look at in the report include support for keeping up with the Biden administration if they push really hard. The spoiler there is that there's lots of support for not getting out yanked. We look at carbon pricing, which people like a lot more than carbon taxes. And we look at where Canadians are at right now on fossil production. And the short answer is that there is, in 2020, 2021, broad agreement that the oil and gas industry is important to the future of Canada's economy. Only among Bloc Québécois and Green Party supporters do you see belief that it's important to the future drop below half. And despite what we've talked about on acceptance of an energy transition to clean energy, the inevitability of that transition, Canadians are still evenly split on whether we ought to be expanding the oil and gas industry and increasing fossil fuel production, as you see in that slide there. So the last thing I'll just end on is talking about COVID and the recovery. We saw that COVID hasn't erased people's concerns about climate. So there's every reason to be empathetic in communication with the situation that people are grappling with, but really no reason not to be pushing forward on climate action. You will find that 6 in 10 Canadians support a broad transformative recovery plan that would address inequality, racism, climate change. When you ask people whether governments should be supporting fossil fuels or renewables when they invest in recovery, it breaks out 68% in favor of renewables, and just 22% think government should be investing in fossil fuels. But there's real polarization around this issue of green stimulus and building back better. Conservative men in particular are really not into it, although interestingly, conservative women seem to be just as supportive of a green stimulus as women from other political identities. And it's important to remember that people are still balancing multiple crises here. If they're forced to choose between a green stimulus and getting existing businesses back on their feet, twice as many Canadians prioritize existing businesses over the green recovery. But still, what we find is that concern about climate change hasn't gone away, and there's lots of potential support coming out of COVID. If anything, we actually see support for addressing climate as part of the recovery rising as the pandemic went on, which is pretty stunning actually when you think about it. Here we're looking at the difference between June and then into November as the third wave was breaking. And it's just one set of data. I don't think you want to put enormous amount of stock that there's a huge increase in public support, but it's certainly not going down, and it probably is actually going up. So the takeaway is that the more we can remove some of the obstacles that we've talked about today and drill into in the report, the more there are really good reasons to be optimistic about driving up support for climate action in the coming months. Now I am going to hand things over to Hugo Seguin for a look at Quebec in particular and top recommendations for messaging. Hugo works for Copticom in Quebec, but he is coming to us today from Brazil, where he got stranded by the pandemic.
True.
So welcome back, at least to virtual Canada, Hugo.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Chris, I concur with the elements of your very good presentation. Very eye-opening analysis, brings us a very good food for thought. I'm impressed by the turnout actually today. I think it bodes extremely well for our collective capacity to become better communicator. As we know, we have a lot of job to do if we want to increase the pace of action in Canada. So the turnout bodes very, very well. I've been asked to contribute a specific piece on Quebec in the report. You'll find in the report a 4 or 5 pager, which is the most recent version of a briefing note that we at Copticom regularly put together for Quebec's community of practice of climate communication, more or less 200 strong members. We've been active for the most of the past more than a year, and graciously supported by foundations, I should say. Clean Economy Fund, McConnell, and Trottier Foundations are backing our community of practice. So I'd say off the bat that from a communications perspective, it makes a lot of sense to treat Quebec as a separate market altogether, not because the polling results are so very different from what you get in some other parts of the country. Sometimes they're exactly the same. Sometimes it's just a question of degree, but mainly because the conversation in Quebec involves distinct communication channels, distinct cultural references, and I would argue most importantly, that Quebec is still very self-referential in a way of looking at, in its way of looking at climate action as something we as Quebecers have to deal with, and mainly through our own provincial government and institutions. So the we that we're juggling with as climate communicators might be different from the we's you guys from outside of Quebec are juggling with your own campaigns. So I only have time to cover some very, very broad, high-level considerations, but for those of you who'd like to know more, to dig into the data and talk to me, I'm more than willing to do so. Just feel free to contact me afterward. So in a nutshell, in terms of communicating on climate, in Quebec, I would say we are in a very good place. I'm happy with the numbers, the figures for Canada in general, but for Quebec, they're very, very good. Not to say that everything is perfect, we'll see that in a few seconds, but just to say that we're not starting within a hostile situation or a hostile environment, that's for sure. To the point that I think with the numbers we're getting, we are at a level of what we can call quasi-societal consensus that climate change is real, it is caused by human activities, and it should be treated as a crisis. So from a communications perspective, I don't think we have to spend resources in Quebec trying to convince people that there is a problem that should be addressed. We're past those changes or those phases in the communication process, I would say. Now I'll try to change my slide. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So polling numbers in Quebec, like I said, are great from a communications perspective. And despite COVID-19, and Chris made a good job showing that despite COVID-19, people are still in demand for climate action. So last December, 79% of Quebecers believed it was imperative that urgent action be taken to address the climate crisis. This is huge numbers. 2/3 of Quebecers believe that protecting the environment trumps the economy, even if it results in an economic slowdown and job losses. I've seen that in the UK. I've seen that in other parts of Europe, that environment trumps the economy, even in pandemic. And I was surprised to see that last June in Quebec in a poll I've conducted through Léger Marketing. 83% want governments to do as much or more on climate change. An incredible 50% want government to do more. And this is during COVID. So again, a very nice place to be when you start communicating on Quebec, on climate in Quebec. I think we won the argument, this argument, and that the opposition we now face in Quebec can be seen as, delaying tactics that can express itself as cautiousness, reluctance, sometimes scorn, but not outright or organized opposition per se. It's not the same dynamic. We don't have a fossil fuel industry. We don't have political forces that wake up in the morning to try to dilute or derail climate action. So again, politically, a very good place to be. Can the slide be changed, please? Okay, thank you. But we're facing two worrisome trends, I would say. One is, and Chris has done an incredible job describing it. People are telling pollsters that they are preoccupied. They are, some of them are alarmed. They want to do more on climate change, but they want to do it slowly at their own pace in small incremental steps. So no aggressive policies, can carry the day. Given the urgency of cutting down emissions, the public in Canada and Quebec are not where they should be. And this is a very preoccupying trend. Second slide, please. I'm very sorry not to be doing it myself. Thank you. No, just before that, please. Okay, thanks. So the second worrying trend for me is that despite what I can label a strong public consensus on climate change, we have this worrisome group of skeptics, non-believers, a block of 20–25% of the population that seem to buy in, with varying degrees, into counter narratives that comes directly from the right-wing populist cesspit, into the counter narrative that, the science is not clear, it's not the right moment, there's nothing we can do. A small number of a small subset are really conspiracy theory people. We see that group, that block, that amorphous block of 20–25%, mostly among men, not surprising, residents of the greater Quebec City region, and conservative voters, again, not surprisingly. What's great is that they're not organized politically. The Conservative Party does not exist as a political force in Quebec, trying to influence Quebec. So if you exclude your usual trolls on your Twitter and Facebook accounts, they're not as yet organized. They have not taken the being anti-climate change as a badge of honor, like a badge of identity, badge of honor that we see, that we often see south of the border. So I will stop here for now, and I'll come back in a few minutes just to complete the messaging that might be a little bit different from Quebec. Thank you. Up to you, Kara.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's Kara Pike with Climate Access, and I don't know, Amber, if you're able to pin my video, but super excited you're all with us. We have such an enormous challenge with needing to cut almost half of emissions by 2030 and prepare for the impacts we're already experiencing. And it's really going to take a diversity of voices calling for action. And so I think it's just great to see how many folks and from all different sectors on this call, because, we have to be able to really apply evidence to what we're doing, learn from one another, and scale what's working to get Canadians actively engaged with achieving that 2030 goal. So we're going to talk a little bit now about, as Chris said, how to remove the obstacles to engagement. There's so much there in terms of people caring, worrying about this issue. And we don't necessarily make it easy for people to really connect it to their lives and what's really relevant and make it easy to act. So we're going to dive into some of the ways to think about this. So the first is to really consider who you're targeting. As you could hear from the presentation, you've got this overall level of support and interest, but it really varies depending on who you're talking to. So Canadians sort of as a whole, that doesn't really exist. It's like you have to think about the different audiences, and keeping in mind that women, younger Canadians, and new Canadians, BIPOC Canadians are most concerned. We have to really, though, meet people where they're at. Climate change is still a big concern, but you know, the pandemic is, the economy, et cetera. So you're really needing to take into consideration where people are coming at the issues from, and perhaps go in through another channel that may be an economic channel. So tying to both the economic impacts of climate change, as well as some of the opportunities around job creation, economic opportunities. And some might say, well, if you're coming more from the climate environmental sector, maybe you're not the best messenger on economic issues. And I think that's important to think about, but there's definitely a role for everyone to play in communicating quality of life issues and care that people working in the fossil fuel sector and other industries that need to transition have support to do so. Tying into health, whether it's the health risks from pollution, extreme weather events, and solutions that really deliver on quality of life. And one thing to really tap into is that people really care about protecting other people in these situations. In some cases, as I said, climate change may not be the topic to enter, but don't leave it out. It's really important that we name it. Bridge from those issues that people are concerned about to climate change. We have to name it because even though there's the support for the solutions, there isn't necessarily a big motivation to prioritize it and do more, which is what we need to do. So we need to really make sure we're being clear on what the threat is. So we also want to think about norms. Moving ahead to the next slide. And I think Chris pointed out some pretty exciting trends that are important to call upon when we're communicating. People are so influenced by their social networks, by what the social norms are. So we really want to think about that. And oftentimes people feel like, I care about this, but it's not really comfortable to talk about it yet, or I'm not really sure where other people are at. And so really emphasizing that, like, Canadians are all in on this. And again, with the caveat of the differences with some of the audiences, but overall, most people do care. And they know the transition is happening, it's inevitable, and we can't keep delaying. And we want the solutions. So these are things that we all want. And let's talk about that in our communications. So a few interesting things from social science that we know when it comes to mental models. There's a couple of three key things we need to hone in on. One is that this is something that is happening now, right? And people feel this way. They're starting to connect the dots when you have the fires and flooding, et cetera, but really making it explicit. This is climate change making these trends so much worse, and that it's harming people now. It's harming people's health, it's threatening lives, it's threatening communities, property, et cetera. As Chris said, if we want to reach that movable middle, we can't assume that people actually know what the heart of the problem is. And this is just, people are busy. And again, this is complex stuff that we often don't make easy to access. So being really clear that burning fossil fuels is 3/4 of the problem, and that the solutions required are government and collective action. Yes, we all need to be taking steps in our own lives, but we need big change, transformational change. And as was mentioned in the previous presentation, there's growing support for addressing climate change as part of the other dramatic changes we have to make coming out of the pandemic. So when we move into some just general framing tips to think about, it's really key to both name the problem and the solution. I just wanted to point out here, emphasize that this is about, as I said, making the threat clear, but not leaving people there. And a lot of times with climate communications, we focus so much on the threat and what's wrong, but we have to move to actually what is possible. And so how do we think about doing this in our communications? Let's go into thinking about this, name the problem, name the solution in a narrative format. And a really simple way to think about how to frame things is that we have to have the challenge, the choice, and the opportunity. Those are the key elements of a narrative, which if you can move to the next slide, that'd be great. And I think what's important to point out here is that the formula is 1/3 threat, so don't leave it out, but it's 2/3 about the solution. What is the choice that we have to make right now at this crossroads moment? What does Canada have to do? So that's about like solvability and addressing the efficacy issues that were raised earlier. And then what's the opportunity? What are the benefits of taking that action? And people typically need to think there are 2 times the benefit than the cost of taking the action to feel motivated. So it's really important that we think about bringing in the threat, making it clear, but emphasizing the pathway forward and the opportunity. And so what can this look like now in this moment of COVID? That we're actually facing multiple threats. And this is something interesting. Normally, people are limited in terms of thinking about things systemically, but the pandemic has kind of cracked that open and people are seeing the connections across issues. So we actually need a plan that can address all of these multiple threats that can take us forward. And the choice is that we have to act now and we can address these issues at the same time. We have an important job in Canada, but we have an important role to play in the world. And this is leaning into that sentiment that Canadians have that we should really be stepping up and doing the right thing. And we've had that in the past. We've done it with the Montreal Protocol. We've done it with World War II, et cetera, that we actually have it in us to step up and do the right thing. And that there are the solutions available. There are the benefits. There are many jobs to be had, not just in clean energy, but in all the work that needs to be done to cut carbon in other areas, as well as prepare our infrastructure, agricultural, other systems for the impacts that we are and will be facing. Talking about the benefits from a lifestyle standpoint, quality of life, safety and security, what people want, what families want, what ordinary Canadians want, that climate action is a pathway to get there. So moving ahead then to break this down a little bit into how do we think about some of the particular issues like clean energy. So as Chris mentioned, people are really getting that the transition is underway. So let's lean into that and really that we have that leadership role to play. And we can't be left behind. We can't be left behind. People in Alberta cannot be left behind. Workers in sectors that need to decarbonize and move away from fossil fuels cannot be left behind. Making the economic case, yes, jobs to be had, economic benefits, but we have to tie that to deeper values and motivations that people have. And that's that doing the right thing, making a contribution, saving on principle, not wasting things, like from the energy efficiency standpoint is a great angle to tap into. And then really to speak to access, how do we make sure that those most impacted by fossil fuels and climate change can access and benefit from the solutions? So for example, from an advocacy standpoint, calling for support for fossil fuel workers to transition into different sectors. If you're in government, making sure that your engagement strategies are inclusive and provide opportunities for those most impacted, but often furthest away from decision-making, to be at the table to help understand the risks, assess the risks, and come up with the climate solutions. COVID, what do we need to do when we're thinking about talking about climate change in a COVID context? As mentioned, good news, climate concern is holding, but we have to proceed with caution. We have to recognize that people are struggling. There's a lot of distress right now. People have gone through a lot. And so again, it's about that balance between being clear about the threat, but really emphasizing that path forward. Really talking about the need for change, solutions that address health, climate, the economy, and equity at the same time, that this is actually the task that we have to take on. Some evidence that the term build back better might resonate, but that's still something being sorted out. And make sure that the pathway forward is really clear. So those are just some recommendations to think about, and there's more in the report that will be coming out, and I'm going to now turn it back to Amber. Thank you.
Amber, do you want me to jump in?
No, classically, I had my mic on mute, so sorry about that. We have some questions coming in, and I encourage everyone to pop those into the Q&A, also to use the chat. So we've had a few people asking about specific types of research, whether or not there has been research that is looking at attitudes towards provincial performance rather than just the federal performance on climate action. We've had a couple of questions related to the alarmed segment and whether or not that's growing. And then a question around the Five Canada's work. I know that we have Eric LaChapelle on the webinar, and he is the author of that. So while we we'll be moving into some specific recommendations for Quebec audiences, but I just wanted to say that please use the Q&A function, and we'll be spending some time with the panelists following Hugo and working that through. So, and also if there are pieces of research from audience members that you know of and that you are willing to share, I encourage you to pop those into the chat, and we'll be collecting those, but also sharing them with each other. So without further ado, Hugo, I will move it over to you, and then we'll move on to Q&A after that.
All right. I won't take too much time because I can ditto a lot of what Kara has told us. I really appreciate this opportunity of banging our collective heads together and come out of this with a more comprehensive understanding of what we're facing. Can you change the slide, please? Yeah, thank you so much. Some communications cues for Quebec. I don't know why those two squares are not. Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so quickly, again, good place to be from a communications perspective. Three quarters of Quebecers are telling us that they want to do more on climate change. Interestingly enough, 74% are saying that how people judge them for what they do on the environment and on climate matters to them. So from a communications perspective or from a marketing perspective, it's great to think of it as an opportunity to use a bandwagon kind of argument, bandwagon being everybody does it, so why don't you, right? So if people are concerned that they might be perceived negatively if they don't do anything on the environment, well, this is clearly an opportunity for us as communicators. In Quebec, intergenerational arguments work splendidly well. When I polled for this during the youth demonstrations in the fall 2019 across Canada, Quebecers were by far the most aligned with youth, what the youth organizations were asking for in terms of climate action. So this is works great for Quebec. 49% in a poll we've conducted more than a year ago are saying that environmentalists as spokespersons are too radical for them. So environmentalists might work extremely well for some segments of the population, but not so much for more conservative segments. So we have to keep that in mind. And I'm echoing here what Kara just said a few seconds ago. If you want to convince somebody to do something more on the environment, the pocketbook argument works less well than altruistic and collective values argument. Don't ask them to do it because it's good for their pocketbooks. Ask them to do it because it's good for the planet. It's good for younger generations. It's the right thing to do. It resonates much more than the selfish arguments. Can we just switch the slide, please? Thank you. So every year we put together objectives for the year, tactics we could espouse, and kind of very high level messaging. The first objective we have is to strengthen the consensus. Not only we have a consensus, but we have to keep that consensus alive. The way we can do that is to use the we Quebecers, we know that. We Quebecers, we understand that. We Quebecers, we want that. I've seen this with Chris and Kara when you say we Canadians, we want to do more, we want to shine amongst the best in the world. So the we is not exactly the same, but it's using the we is to naturalize a consensus, to make it as something that is natural. And this is something we'd like to do. Second and most important objective for 2021 is to push for more action. It's a no-brainer. We don't want to slap people on the face because they're not doing enough. We want to acknowledge that they're telling us that they are concerned that they're doing something. We want to encourage them to do more. And what we're introducing this year that is new is that for the very first time, we think we have to address that very concerning block of 20-25% of the population that is affected by counter narrative. I don't exactly know how to do it. I just know that we have to do it, and to gnaw at some of that group and bring that portion of the group within the larger fold. And this has to be done through a separate communication stream so as not to pollute the general messaging that we are all on board on climate change. In terms of tactics, young people, community leaders, we've talked about that, sometimes scientists, and something maybe controversial, you'll tell me, but for more conservative segments of the population, the issue is not to convince them, the issue is to lead. We're not out there as communicators to convince people that there's a problem, especially for conservative segments. Polling after polling in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, those people, they don't want to be convinced, they want to be led. They like authority, they like hierarchy, they like leadership. So in terms of tactics, I think we have to go that route. Again, controversial. I'd like to know what you think about that. In terms of messaging, very, very high level. There's a crisis. We have to deal with it urgently. It's worsening. We need to do more. And I didn't have time to dig into this, but in Quebec, as in the rest of the country, there's more and more convergence between social issues and environmental issues, especially during COVID. Solidarity, equity, justice is very high on the list. So to recognize that people are suffering, but they're still concerned about climate change, merging the two streams makes a lot of sense from a messaging perspective. Last slide, please, and I'll stop there. We've put together a 4 or 5 pages for you to look at, but there's more stuff out there, very, very good stuff like the Baromètre de l'Action Climatique. It's an annual, and it looks at values, how value change with time, how people react on certain propositions in terms of policies. So if people want to dig a little bit more, the Baromètre is the place to go. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our panelists. I think at this point, Maria, if we could stop sharing our screen and move into a gallery view, that would be helpful. While we're kind of prepping things on our side, I just wanted to encourage people to share their, we do have a lot of researchers, we have a lot of people who are working in this, who are conducting their own research. If there are pieces that you would like to share more broadly, please feel free to include those links in the chat section. We have a couple questions here to start off with, and I encourage you to use the Q&A. We've got one around attitudes, specifically if you came across attitudes towards activists, Chris, and I think maybe you could also talk a little bit about some of the gaps that you did find in the research where we didn't find information. So that's maybe one for you, Chris. Kara, we have a question here around how do we draw attention to the problem in the crisis and the solutions that are required. So someone asking specifically around that adaptation, the severity of the crisis, if you have any recommendations for that. And then Hugo, there's a question for you regarding Quebec and the kind of awareness or the discourse around fossil fuels specifically, and kind of the where perceptions or where that is in Quebec around kind of the dependence on fossil fuels and the role in the economy, that kind of thing. So why don't we'll start with you, Chris, and then we'll move to you, Kara, and then to you, Hugo.
So, I mean, do I understand correctly that the question is around audiences that are not well studied?
Audiences that are not well studied, gaps in the research. The specific question was related to whether or not we have any polling on support or perceptions of climate activists. So curious what you have.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that last point, I think it's a really interesting point, because what you will find is similar to what Hugo was saying in Quebec, that people, somewhere around half of the public are skeptical of environmentalists as spokespeople. So I think, no reason not to believe that as a point of evidence. But, what I would say there is that if that were really true, then we all should have told Greta Thunberg to stay home. And sometimes what polling and research gives you is a snapshot of where people are at in the moment, not necessarily where things need to go. And it also can only tell you what people think they think. It doesn't tell you really how things are going to bounce in the real world, how people are going to actually react. So while I think it may be largely true for environmental groups per se, that they're best used communicating with the alarmed and should be putting resources into finding, adjacent messengers and resourcing folks to communicate with the concerned, that much bigger group. It's certainly the case that youth resonate. Like that is one that does cut across all segments. And I think it's because the youth messengers embody that moral frame. They don't even have to say this is a moral argument, right? They're just, by virtue of who they are and being out there communicating, are massively, massively influential. And there's whole new academic field of study on the so-called Greta effect, and all of the youth that were involved. I don't want to only focus on her, but of course, there's always someone that's emblematic of the movement. So I think that, especially coming out of COVID, it's really important for all of us to do everything we can to get air in the tires of that youth movement again. That's one place where it seems to me that message and moral frame and everything comes together in such an important way. And I think it's probably the main reason why we saw that surge of support in 2019 that got wiped off by the pandemic. Not that the support got wiped off, but the priority got wiped off. And if coming out of the pandemic, we want to see it rise to the top of the agenda again, I think youth voices are going to be critical.
Great, thank you, Chris. So Kara, the question here is around how to talk about adaptation, how to talk about the crisis. Can you speak about communicating about climate adaptation and connection to building broader support for climate action? So I'll hand that over to you.
Great, thank you. About 6 years ago, I guess, I did focus groups for Clean Energy Canada in British Columbia. And even at that time, people still felt climate change was a distant threat and would mention the Philippines or, other places around the world. And that's changed. We are all living the climate crisis now, and really making sure that when the extreme weather events are happening, we're making that connection clear. And I know in the past, there was a lot of hesitation around that because the field of attribution science had not developed as much as it has now. But now we have a pretty good grounding, and we cannot, say that the trends, wildfire, heat, et cetera, are exacerbated by climate change. But the pace at which the scientists are actually able to study a storm and come out with, this event was 3 times more intense because of climate change is really quite astounding. So I think we can lean into that. But the important thing is that we're already paying the price for climate change, right? To make that clear, we're paying it with our health, we're paying with our lives, we're spending just an incredible amount of money responding to extreme weather events, and we're paying by gambling our children's futures. And the choice is about, are we going to continue to not act and all of these trends get worse, or act now while we still have a lot of choice and the ability to actually move the trends in a different direction? So where do we want to put our time and energy, in the cleanup or in getting ahead of the curve? On adaptation in particular, so there's so much we could talk about, but I think first to maybe step back from that whole idea of talking about adaptation, that isn't a term most people relate to. From my experience, most of the public don't separate what needs to happen from an adaptation standpoint from a mitigation standpoint. It's, I'm worried about climate change, what do I do? Having said that, extreme weather is a growing concern, and you can enter into that, and especially in places where there may still be difficulties talking directly about climate change. You can enter through the talking about the trends, and often you can compare to past trends, like where were we at compared to where we're now? Because that's based on what happened, not future projections, which some people who may be more skeptical can buy into. But, this idea that we're getting more of these events, and we're at this tipping point where, again, we can choose to either act to reduce the threat or pay with bigger consequences later. And I think that in terms of connecting that, so again, not to shy away from the scale of the challenge, but then in terms of the solutions, they have to also be on that scale. And I think what's really interesting is that going through the extreme weather, what do we do to prepare, which is a much better term than adapt, actually moves people really along a trajectory where they see that we have to cut emissions, that adapting and preparing isn't enough, we have to do it. But if we really want to get to the bottom of it, we actually need to do deep work around emissions reduction. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And in particular, when we're talking about preparing for impacts, we have to have centered in that the voices and needs of those most impacted by climate change, whether that be because of having faced systemic racism or injustice, because of economic situations, health, the type of work that you do, your age, to really think very, very hard about how do we make sure that those folks are really included in the outreach efforts and in co-creating the solutions that we need. Thanks, Amber.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara. So Hugo, the questions for you, there's kind of 2 now. One is how much of what you've presented for Quebec could be transferable to the rest of Canada? And then the specific question was around how permanent, or I might say how resonant fossil fuel messaging is within Quebec. And so just before you say that, I just want to say that Louise Comeau has shared in the chat a resource around communicating around extreme events. And also Eric LaChapelle has shared in the Q&A, and we'll move that over to the chat, that they will be publishing more around this kind of alarmed and the changes in the alarmed, et cetera. So for you, Hugo, how much of what you presented is transferable to the rest of Canada, and also your sense of the resonance around oil and gas and fossil fuels?
Can I try to answer the easiest one, which is the second one?
Only hard questions, Hugo.
Only hard question. I'll come back to the first one because it's a very important one. But the fossil fuel messaging do not resonate in Quebec, and I'll try to expand on this. Napoleon, quoting Napoleon now, said that geopolitics is a function of your geography, right? Our politics and our policies across Canada are a function of our national resources endowment. There's no oil and there's no gas production in Quebec. And it structures the political economy of Quebec, I would say. There's no economic force that wakes up in the morning trying to defend its turf when it comes to oil and gas, because there's no oil and gas interest that is substantial in Quebec. So I would go as far as to say that Quebec is a hydrocarbon hostile territory, and we've seen that with the moratorium on shale gas. We've seen that in the cancellation of the Energy East pipeline. We've seen that with the oil and gas projects on Anticosti Island, and maybe we'll see that for a natural gas terminal in a few weeks. But Quebec is not a nice place to do business for oil and gas interests, that's for sure. So it does not resonate very, very well, and it's not kind of part of the conversation in Quebec that we should be shedding tears for the oil and gas interest in the rest of the country. In terms of what I said that could be transferable to the rest of the country, this is really a question that keeps me awake at night, because I don't know what is Quebec specific in what we're achieving and what can be broadened up. The only thing I've seen with all the years I've spent working on the issue is that Quebecers work more collaboratively than in the rest of the country and across sectors. So it's historic. We work with industry representatives, financial institutions, trade unions, social NGOs, environmental NGOs, and we co-develop asks on climate. And we've been doing that for 10 or 15 years, ensuring that there's kind of a collective consensus of what is asked at our government, and leaving little place for players who are not members of that consensus to express themselves. So I think that is something that could be transferable in a way in the rest of the country, that grouping of, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in the rest of the country, but I think it's peculiar to Quebec, this form of interaction, in collective and societal interaction on climate change. So I'll stop here, because I'm just going to say obvious things or things that are not interesting.
Thank you, Hugo. So the next question is for you, Chris. In terms of the polls that you reviewed, and I just throw it out there that I think it was more than 40. Is there anything that you can say around regional differences? Or there's a specific question from Jamie looking at how attitudes tend to be tied, this follows your comment, Hugo, tends to be tied to the economies of the region. So just curious if there's anything that kind of stood out for you around regional differences in engagement to these issues. And then there was a second question, whether or not there is some specific polling around how long Canadians think the transition will take. And so I know that we have researchers in here who have also looked at that. But Chris, that couple of questions for you. And then for you, Kara, there's a question here around if there's specific advice for you, Hugo, as well, if you have specific advice for people engaging with MPs or political leaders, and if we have a sense of how much of the Canadian population is broadly reflected in our elected officials. So we know we have a large movable middle, 45%, 25% alarmed. Curious if anybody on this, the webinar or of the panelists know whether or not there's anything looking specifically at our elected officials and their attitudes, but also what recommendations we might have when communicating with them. So for you, Chris, I'll go back. If you have anything you'd like to add on regional differences and how long the transition might take, and then we'll open it up to the last question.
Well, length of transition is probably the easier one to hit first. There's a really interesting convergence of findings around about a decade, 10 years. When you talk at about 10 years, then you find that people who want a gradual transition and people who want aggressive transition are actually in their heads both thinking in terms of about a decade. So that's, I think, one really interesting point in terms of timing. And actually, it points to the fact that polarization on transition is not actually as big as tends to come out in some of the findings. And that's because people are thinking actually the same thing in their heads and expressing it in different words. That said, as we saw, a lot of people don't think the transition is even possible, right? So it really does bring up this whole question of efficacy and solvability and the need to paint a picture for people concretely of what this is going to look like, how feasible it is, how successfully it's happening in other countries, so that people can have something to grab onto, so they picture it in their head and that they know it's possible. In terms of regional divides, there's so much in this. One of the really interesting things is that it's more actually about politics and political identity than it is even about region. A lot of the polling that's been really interesting coming out of Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa shows that political identity is even more important than ideology, which you would think would be kind of similar. But if you're really committed to the Conservative Party of Canada, what seems to be happening is that leadership cues from within the Conservative movement are really driving that segment. And then how that interfaces with regional is, sort of obvious. We've got a lot more folks like that on the prairies that fall into that kind of political identity. And just the final last point here is that there's an even bigger kind of disruptive divide, which is that we have a pretty big group in Canada of hardcore authoritarian tendency population. It's maybe 20% of the country you could talk about as Northern Trumpists. 30% of the country really do have these authoritarian values. And what's really interesting is that it's much more heavily concentrated in the prairies. So a lot of what's probably driving Western alienation, quote unquote, I'm from BC, so I kind of hate the getting lumped in with Western alienation, but there's that political dynamic is also underneath a lot of the regional divide and polarization that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. So this will be our last question before we wrap up. So Hugo, Kara, I encourage you both to jump in. Any recommendations when talking about, when talking to elected officials or political representatives coming out of the research and what we've covered here today?
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. I personally haven't seen a survey of elected officials and where they are on the issues, but from previous work I've seen in the States, the elected officials often tend to line up across the segments, so the 6 Americas. But again, I can't say that is exactly the case in Canada, but you do tend to see a broad range of views among elected officials. For those who are willing to act or maybe like on the fence, I think there's a couple of things to think about. Is that number one, they need to know that there's demand for action. So this comes back to like that normative piece around how many people want action, but also, you know, thinking about the relationship between voices from the outside advocating for government change and how that fits with what you're able to do, and perhaps thinking about collaborations between community groups, et cetera, want to see action. A lot of times there's fear that we can't go out and be bold on this issue. And I just think that's actually not the case. I think there's an appetite for this. And we do know from the research that it's very important that people see that elected leaders are talking about this issue and acting on it and making it a priority. Otherwise, it's like you're telling me this is the biggest threat ever, and yet our leaders aren't acting, right? So there's an imbalance there. So it's really critical the elected leaders get out there. The fear for pushback is never as real as it is in the world. In fact, I did a project for a number of local governments around that had declared climate emergencies. And what we found is that, if anything, the response to that was not criticism, but so now what's next? What are we going to do? Like, let's go. What's the plan? And so, you know, I think it's reminding folks that there's a lot of appetite for action, and that elected leaders have a responsibility to actually model and normalize climate concern conversations and action.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kara. Hugo, anything to add to that? We've got maybe 30 seconds left before we are going to wrap up.
Two things. One, a lot of people in our environmental world has left the public sphere for and that flight from the public sphere we've seen in the last decades. Some people are rejecting elected politics. They don't want to do anything. Don't want to have to do anything about it. They're happy doing small stuff at the local level, and they're disconnected with the greater politics and policies. And we have to re-engage the politics, and not only re-engaging it because we think we can achieve collective goals, but to try to dilute that disconnect between elected officials and what we're advocating for. We have to become elected officials ourselves. I see that Aaron Friedman from Green PAC is on our webinar. He would have tons of things to say about that. Thank you, Aaron, for your work on this. But this is what I'd like to add.
Thank you. Well, there's many questions left unanswered, and I think that goes to show the importance of this work. It's certainly been our experience over the past few years in working on this, that people find a lot of benefit in coming together, in connecting, in being, sharing with each other what they're working on, sharing solutions. And that is something that will be Climate Narratives Initiative and Climate Access will be working together over the next few months to help bring more resources like the one that we will share with you after this. So report and recording coming after the webinar. But also we have a number of other offerings that we'd love to hear what you think. And so once the webinar ends, there will be a survey for you to provide feedback. And let us know both what would be useful for you moving forward, but also importantly, if you are interested in joining a community of practice, focused on research, sharing research, and making meaning out of it. That is something that we're considering and would love to support. So I think right now I would just like to add, you are not alone. Might feel that we're also might feel like we're alone in these times, particularly so many of us isolated from each other, but you're not. There is a community of people. Many of you were here today, and thank you for showing up. Thank you very much, Kara. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Chris, for all of the work and time that you've spent doing this. And thank you to the funders who are supporting this work. Shout out to Joanna Leffler at the Clean Economy Fund, who has been instrumental in supporting us over the last years, both in terms of her guidance, but also in making connections and bringing people together. I know that there are other funders here on the call, and so thank you. Your support is critical. We will be sharing the recording, we will be sharing the report, and we'll be sharing a survey to get your feedback. So without anything else, good luck and have a good day. Thank you.